What is coming will not announce itself with fire and thunder. It will not begin with one dramatic explosion that tells the world the war has started again. It will not begin with a clean declaration from Tehran, or a perfect statement from Washington, or a map placed on a briefing room screen with red arrows and easy answers. It may begin with something far quieter, a base placed on alert, a family at home receiving a message that deployment has been extended, a Gulf monarchy asking Washington for reassurance behind closed doors, a U.S. destroyer changing course in dark water, a radar system tracking movement that may be nothing or may be the beginning of something far worse, a missile that does not need to land, a drone that does not need to kill, a warning that does not need to become war in order to change the entire calculation. And that is why this moment is so dangerous, because the real story is not simply that Iran may strike American bases. That is the visible story. The deeper story is that Iran may be turning America's entire Gulf-based network into something far more difficult for Washington to manage: a hostage map. Pay close attention to what follows, because the mainstream question is too simple. The mainstream asks whether Iran can defeat the United States. That is the wrong question. Iran does not need to defeat the United States in a conventional war. It does not need to sink the U.S. Navy. It does not need to destroy every American base in the Gulf. It does not need to win the skies, control the seas, or match America weapon for weapon. Iran only needs to do something much colder. It needs to make every American base feel politically expensive. It needs to make every American ship feel exposed. It needs to make every Gulf ally wonder whether hosting American power now brings protection or danger. It needs to make every soldier, every contractor, every radar site, every logistics hub, every runway, every port facility, and every command center part of a larger pressure system. Because once a military base becomes a possible trigger, it stops being only a symbol of power. It becomes leverage. It becomes exposure. It becomes a hostage to geography. This is not theater. This is mathematics. A modern military empire does not run only on aircraft carriers, bombers, missiles, and flags. It runs on access. It runs on host nations. It runs on basing rights. It runs on fuel storage, airfields, repair docks, radar coverage, intelligence sites, logistics corridors, diplomatic permission, and the assumption that the countries hosting that military machine will continue accepting the risk that comes with it. That assumption is now being tested, and Iran knows it. For decades, the United States built a military architecture around Iran. From Washington's perspective, this was deterrence. It was containment. It was forward defense. It was the map of American reach: bases in the Gulf, naval facilities, air defense systems, ships in narrow waters, troops in allied territory, logistics hubs close enough to move fast, strike fast, and reassure allies quickly. That was the American view. But Tehran looks at the same map differently. Iran does not only see containment. Iran sees pressure points: Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, Syria, the Gulf of Oman, the Persian Gulf, the shipping lanes, the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the host governments, the political relationships that keep the whole structure standing. America looks at that map and says, this is how we project power. Iran looks at that map and says, this is where pressure can be applied. That is the hidden reversal. America built the Gulf-based network to contain Iran. Iran may now be using that same network to contain America. Not physically, politically, strategically, psychologically. Because every base carries a question. If Iran fires near it, does America respond? If America responds, does the ceasefire collapse? If the ceasefire collapses, do Gulf states become part of the war? If Gulf states become part of the war, do they still want American forces on their soil? If one American dies, does Washington strike Iran directly? If Washington strikes Iran directly, does the entire region ignite? If Washington does not strike, does American deterrence look broken? This is how a military network becomes a political cage. And that is where Iran's leverage begins. The visible war is missiles. The invisible war is access. The visible map shows American bases around Iran. The invisible map shows Iran placing pressure around those bases. And in modern strategy, the invisible map often matters more. Now understand the first layer of the hostage map. America's Gulf bases were designed to create certainty. Certainty for allies, certainty for oil markets, certainty for Israel, certainty for Washington's military planners, certainty that if Iran crossed a line, American power was already nearby. But proximity is not always strength. Sometimes proximity is vulnerability. If you are close enough to deter, you are also close enough to be threatened. If you are close enough to strike, you are also close enough to be struck back. If your forces are forward deployed, your credibility is forward deployed with them. That is why Iran does not need to erase the American presence in the Gulf. It only needs to make that presence feel unstable. A single base alert can travel through Washington faster than a speech. A single missile claim can move markets faster than a diplomatic cable. A single drone warning can force commanders to adjust posture. A single incident near a US ship can create hours of confusion. A single casualty can transform a regional confrontation into a domestic crisis. Iran understands this because Iran is not trying to win the kind of war America wants to measure. America measures destruction. Iran measures pressure. America counts intercepts. Iran counts political reactions. America asks whether the base is still standing. Iran asks whether that base still feels useful to the country hosting it. That is the battlefield. And it is far more dangerous than it appears. Phase 1 is the exposure phase. This phase does not require total war. It requires Iran to remind everyone that American forces in the Gulf are not untouchable. Not necessarily by launching a massive attack. That would be too clear, too easy to answer, too easy for Washington to frame as aggression. The more effective method is controlled pressure. Warnings, claims, missile movements, drone approaches, naval encounters, proxy statements, suspicious activity near shipping lanes, base alerts that do not become headline wars but still create a permanent sense of danger. This is the genius of gray zone pressure. It creates fear without clarity. It creates danger without clean responsibility. It creates urgency without giving the stronger power the simple battlefield it wants. And once that atmosphere forms, every American base begins to carry a new meaning. It no longer says only, America is here. It also says, America can be pulled in here. That distinction is everything, because deterrence depends on the belief that forward presence gives Washington control. Iran's strategy may be to show that forward presence also gives Tehran options. Phase 2 is the host nation phase. This is the part most commentators avoid because it is uncomfortable. American bases in the Gulf do not exist in empty space. They exist inside countries. They depend on governments. They depend on local politics. They depend on elite bargains, public silence, economic interests, military agreements, and the belief that hosting American forces brings more protection than danger. Iran's objective is to disturb that belief, not destroy it overnight. Disturb it. Make Gulf leaders wonder whether the American umbrella now attracts lightning. Make them ask whether a US base on their territory makes them safer or turns their territory into the next warning message. Make them quietly pressure Washington to de-escalate while publicly repeating that the alliance remains strong. Make them fear that one Iranian retaliation could land not in Washington, not in Tel Aviv, but near their own ports, airports, oil facilities, or military districts. That is how Iran multiplies pressure. It does not pressure America alone. It pressures the relationships that allow America to remain powerful. A base is not just concrete and aircraft. A base is permission, and permission can become fragile. This is why the Gulf states matter. They are not background scenery in the Iran-America confrontation. They are the platforms on which American strategy rests. If those platforms become nervous, American power becomes more complicated. Not impossible, but complicated. And in geopolitics, making your enemy's power more complicated is often the first step toward making it less useful. Phase 3 is the Washington phase. This is where the external crisis becomes an internal argument. Iran knows America is powerful. It also knows America is divided. It knows Washington can move ships quickly but cannot always move political consensus. It knows American presidents can threaten force, but must still survive the consequences of using it. That is why every Gulf incident has two audiences. The first audience is military: commanders, ships, bases, radar networks, air defense crews, and regional planners. The second audience is political: Congress, media, voters, allies, donors, military families, and rival factions inside Washington. Iran's pressure only needs to travel from the Gulf to Washington. Once it arrives there, America begins doing part of Iran's work by itself. One side says strike harder, another side says stop the war. One side says protect the troops, another side asks why the troops are there. One side says Iran only understands force, another side says Iran is trying to trap America in another Middle East conflict. One side says Gulf bases prove American strength, another side asks whether those bases have become hostages. That debate is not a side effect, it is the strategic result. Because when Washington splits, deterrence becomes harder to read. And when deterrence becomes harder to read, Tehran gains room to maneuver. This is not because Iran controls America. It does not. It is because Iran understands a simple truth about democratic superpowers. Military power requires political permission, and political permission is vulnerable to fear, fatigue, casualties, confusion, and doubt. The hostage map is designed around that vulnerability. Now, let us be clear. This does not mean Iran wants an uncontrolled war with America. That would be an enormous risk. Iran's leaders understand American conventional power. They understand what U.S. air and naval forces can destroy. They understand that a direct, unmistakable attack on Americans could produce consequences they may not be able to manage. But strategy is not always about seeking the maximum attack. Sometimes strategy is about finding the maximum pressure short of the maximum attack. That is where Iran operates most effectively. Near the line, around the line, under the line. Close enough to create fear. Ambiguous enough to avoid immediate total retaliation. This is why Gulf bases are so important. They allow Iran to create pressure without necessarily beginning the war Washington expects. A base alert is not war. A missile warning is not necessarily war. A drone interception is not necessarily war. A naval encounter is not necessarily war. A proxy threat is not necessarily war. But together, they create the conditions where peace becomes exhausting. And an exhausting peace can become as strategically useful as a limited war. That is the danger, because America is now defending not only its forces, it is defending the credibility of its entire regional architecture. If U.S. bases look vulnerable, allies get nervous. If allies get nervous, Washington must reassure them. If Washington reassures them with more deployments, Iran gets more targets to pressure. If Washington reduces exposure, critics call it retreat. If Washington strikes Iran, the ceasefire dies. If Washington absorbs pressure, deterrence looks weaker. This is the cage. Every option carries cost. And Iran does not need to choose America's next move. It only needs to make every next move worse. That is what it means to turn bases into a hostage map. A hostage is valuable not because it attacks you. A hostage is valuable because it limits you. It forces you to calculate. It forces you to hesitate. It forces you to consider consequences that did not exist before. America's Gulf bases were supposed to expand Washington's options. Iran's pressure campaign may be designed to make them limit Washington's options. That is the reversal. And this reversal is not new in history. Empires have always mistaken forward positions for permanent control. Rome built forts along frontiers and believed the frontier had been stabilized. Britain built naval stations and believed the sea lanes had been secured. The Soviet Union placed forces across its sphere and believed presence meant obedience. The United States built bases across the Middle East and believed proximity meant dominance. But every forward position has a hidden cost. It must be defended. It must be supplied. It must be politically justified. It must be protected from attack. It must be explained when danger rises. And if the enemy can make the cost of maintaining that position greater than the visible benefit, then the base begins to lose its strategic meaning. It remains physically present, but politically weakened. This is how power erodes without disappearing. American forces do not need to leave the Gulf tomorrow for Iran to gain leverage. They only need to become more expensive to keep there, more controversial, more exposed, more difficult for host countries to defend, more difficult for Washington to explain, more vulnerable to becoming the trigger for a war nobody wants but everyone has prepared for. That is the entire point. Now consider the geography. Iran sits close enough to the Gulf to make American presence permanently nervous. The Gulf is narrow, the bases are known, the shipping lanes are crowded, the oil infrastructure is critical, the host countries are wealthy but geographically exposed. The US Navy is powerful, but power in confined waters always operates under pressure. This is not the open Pacific. This is a pressure chamber. And in a pressure chamber, small events have large consequences. A drone near a base, a missile near a ship, a warning near an oil facility, a claim of retaliation, a single radar alert, a single casualty. These are not minor events when the political system is already tense. They become sparks inside a room filled with gas. That is why Iran's strategy may be less about spectacular destruction and more about permanent tension. Permanent tension forces America to spend. Spend money, spend attention, spend political capital, spend military readiness, spend alliance credibility, spend presidential bandwidth. Every day that U.S. forces remain under threat, Washington pays a cost. Every day that Gulf allies fear retaliation, Washington pays a cost. Every day that markets price regional instability, Washington pays a cost. Every day that the ceasefire survives only by luck, Washington pays a cost. Iran's calculation may be simple. If we cannot defeat American power directly, we can make American power expensive to maintain. And that is a real strategy, not glamorous, not clean, not cinematic in the way television understands war, but historically effective, because great powers rarely lose because they cannot win battles. They lose when every victory costs more than the political system wants to pay. That is the danger America faces in the Gulf. Not defeat, overextension, not collapse, constraint, not military weakness, political exposure. The bases are still there, the ships are still there, the weapons are still there, the alliance structure is still there. But Iran is asking a deeper question. Are they still assets if every one of them can become a trigger? That is the question Washington does not want to answer, because answering it honestly would require admitting that American power in the Gulf has entered a more fragile phase. The old confidence was simple: bases deter Iran. The new reality may be more complicated. Bases deter Iran but also give Iran pressure points. Both can be true at the same time. That is what makes the situation dangerous. The same base that reassures an ally can endanger that ally. The same ship that projects power can become a headline risk. The same troop deployment that signals strength can become a political vulnerability. The same forward presence that once stabilized the region can now become the mechanism through which escalation spreads. This is not a contradiction. It is the logic of empire under pressure. Now, what is America's answer? More air defense, more ships, more warnings, more sanctions, more diplomatic pressure? All of those may matter, but none of them fully solve the central problem. Because the central problem is not only whether America can protect its bases, the central problem is whether America can protect the political meaning of those bases. A defended base can still be a liability. A protected ship can still be a provocation. A surviving military network can still be strategically expensive. And Iran understands that survival is not the same as freedom of action. If America's forces remain safe only by staying on constant alert, that is a cost. If Gulf allies host American forces only while fearing Iranian retaliation, that is a cost. If Washington can deter Iran only by risking a wider war every time an incident occurs, that is a cost. If Trump must respond to every provocation through the lens of domestic politics, that is a cost. Iran's strategy is built around accumulating those costs, not in one day, not in one strike, not in one dramatic escalation, but slowly, incident by incident, warning by warning, base alert by base alert, headline by headline, until the question changes. At first, Washington asks, how do we contain Iran? Later, Washington may ask, how do we keep our own regional architecture from containing us? That is the moment Iran wants. Because the strongest form of pressure is not when you force your enemy to move. It is when you make your enemy afraid of moving. And right now, America's Gulf posture may be entering exactly that zone. Too much presence to ignore, too many troops to risk, too many allies to reassure, too many bases to protect, too many ships to defend, too many political consequences attached to every incident. This is how the trap works. Iran does not need to pull America into war immediately. It needs to make the possibility of war follow America everywhere in the Gulf. That possibility becomes the hostage taker, and America's bases become the hostages. Now, capability is not inevitability. Iran may choose restraint. Washington may manage the crisis. Gulf states may pressure both sides to step back. Diplomacy may create temporary distance. Military commanders may avoid miscalculation. The ceasefire may survive another week, another month, perhaps longer. But capabilities carefully built do not disappear. Geography does not disappear. Forward bases do not disappear. Missile range do not disappear, proxy networks do not disappear, domestic political divisions do not disappear, and the memory of vulnerability does not disappear. It waits for the next incident, it waits for the next warning, it waits for the next night when a commander sees something on radar and must decide whether this is the moment the ceasefire begins to die. That is why this crisis is not over, even when the guns are quiet, even when the diplomats speak, even when markets calm, even when leaders say the situation is under control, the pressure system remains. And that pressure system is the real story, not the explosion, the exposure, not the attack, the access, not the missile, the map. America built a map of bases around Iran. Iran may now be turning that map into a map of risk around America. That is the strategic reversal. And if Washington does not understand it, the next phase of this conflict will not surprise us because it was invisible. It will surprise us because it was visible all along, and almost nobody wanted to describe it plainly. So the real question is not whether America can defend its Gulf bases. It can. The real question is whether America can still use those bases freely when Iran has learned how to make every one of them politically expensive. What do you think? Are America's Gulf bases still the foundation of deterrence? Or has Iran found a way to turn them into a hostage map against Washington? Share your perspective in the comments, because this debate is not only about Iran, it is not only about the Gulf, it is not only about one base, one ship, or one warning shot. It is about whether American power still controls the map, or whether the map has quietly begun controlling America.